I was always the one my family looked down on, just because of my job. But when they chose my sister's rich fiancé over me, that was the last straw. They told me my work wasn't good enough, so I stopped paying their bills. I decided it was time to show them who was really keeping a roof over their heads. Now that they see I'm the one who's been supporting them all along, suddenly, I'm good enough, and they want to make amends. Hey, Reddit. This one's a bit of a wild ride, so buckle up. I've always felt overlooked because of my career, but what happened recently was way more messed up than I ever expected. I never thought they'd throw me under the bus just to keep up with their obsession over appearances. Anyway, let me take you through the whole mess. I'm 34, a trucker based just outside Pittsburgh. I've been hauling freight for 8 years now. It's not the glamorous lifestyle my family imagined for me, but it pays the bills, and honestly, I love the freedom of the open road. There's something about driving across the country, watching the scenery change from desert to mountains to plains, while everyone else is stuck in their office cubicles. It really gives you a new perspective on life. The quiet of the highway, those random diners with surprisingly amazing pie, it's a life that fits me, even if no one else in my family really gets it. I haven't always been on the road by myself, though. For the last 5 years, I've had the best co-pilot anyone could ask for, a rescue mutt named Diesel. I found him at a rest stop in Oklahoma during a thunderstorm, shaking and scared, hiding under a dumpster. No collar, no chip. I wrapped him in my spare jacket, shared some beef jerky, and by morning, we were inseparable. Diesel's a medium-sized mutt, a mix of who knows what, with one floppy ear and one that stands up like a radar. He's sharp as hell, though. He can tell the difference between a loading dock and a way station, and he gets either hyped up or irritated depending on which one we're at. Honestly, he's better company than most people I know. Growing up in my family? It felt like I was an extra in a movie where everyone else had a speaking role. My older brother, Liam, is 37, and he's a big-shot corporate lawyer in Philly, with the corner office, the designer suits, all that stuff. My younger sister, Courtney, 29, works for a tech startup that just got a ton of investment money. Both of them went to college, both of them make 6 figures, and both are the absolute golden children in my parents' eyes. Liam's the kind of guy who's gotta name drop his college within the first 5 minutes of a conversation, and he wears those pretentious glasses that probably don't even have prescription lenses. Courtney's all about her personal brand and has one of those job titles that sounds fancy but doesn't actually mean anything, innovation catalyst or some other nonsense like that. Every time we got together as a family, it'd always turn into the Liam and Courtney show. Liam's bragging about winning another case, Courtney's talking about her startup getting featured in some business magazine, and meanwhile, I'm sitting there, invisible, passing the mashed potatoes, just wondering if anyone would even notice if I stood up and walked out. They probably wouldn't even notice if I left. And then there's me, the middle child who never lived up to anyone's expectations. I dropped out of college after 2 years because, honestly, I couldn't stand being stuck in a classroom anymore. My dad never let me forget that choice. Your brother was at the top of his class at Penn State, and you couldn't even finish community college. Yeah, thanks, Dad. Heard that 100 times. My mom would always give me that look, the one that mixed pity and disappointment, like I was some stray dog that couldn't be house-trained. The truth is, I was always more hands-on. Liam was busy memorizing legal cases, and Courtney was figuring out how to shake up entire industries. I was the one who could tear an engine apart and put it back together by the time I was 16. I was the one who fixed the roof after that big storm in '08 when there wasn't a contractor to be found. I was the one who figured out how to unclog a toilet without calling a plumber and dropping $200. But none of that counted in my family's idea of success. Every family gathering played out the same way. Liam would talk about some huge case he was handling. Courtney would brag about her latest promotion. And there I was, sitting in the background while my parents acted like I didn't exist, unless, of course, they needed something fixed. And then, suddenly, I was useful. Jimmy, the sink's leaking. Jimmy, can you take a look at Mom's car? Jimmy, we need help moving this furniture. It's funny how my so-called failed career path never stopped them from asking for free labor. But heaven forbid they ask Liam to get his manicured hands dirty. Wouldn't want him to chip a nail while he's typing up those important legal briefs. And then there's Courtney, too busy networking, which really means posting motivational quotes on LinkedIn to help around the house. I'll never forget one Thanksgiving when the furnace crapped out right before dinner. While everyone else was panicking about the turkey getting cold, I was down in the basement, flashlight in my teeth, fixing the damn thing. Took me 2 hours. By the time I came back upstairs, sweaty and covered in dust, dinner was already over. They'd saved me a plate, cold turkey with congealed gravy. Liam was going off about some celebrity client, and not a single person acknowledged that I just saved them from having to call an emergency HVAC guy on a holiday. That would have cost at least $1,000, on top of the worst part of the season. For the last 3 years, I've quietly been paying their property taxes, about $350 every quarter. One day, Mom called me in tears, saying they might lose the house because Dad's retirement wasn't covering everything. So, I stepped up. No thanks, no recognition. I didn't need it, but a simple, thank you, every now and then would have been nice. Instead, they kept treating me like I was the family's charity case. Poor Jimmy with his truck driving job. At least he's not on drugs, I guess. That was my mom's version of a compliment to her bridge club friends, one I overheard once. I wasn't always a truck driver. After dropping out of college, I tried a bunch of different jobs, worked construction for a while, spent some time as a mechanic at my uncle's shop, even tried bartending, but nothing really clicked until I got behind the wheel of a big rig. There's something about the responsibility of handling an 80,000-pound vehicle, the problem-solving when you're stuck in crazy weather or traffic, and, yeah, the freedom of not having some boss breathing down your neck all day. It just clicked for me. The real turning point came when I met Miguel at a truck stop just outside Memphis. He was an old-school trucker, probably in his 60s, with silver hair pulled back into a ponytail and arms covered in faded navy tattoos. I was having trouble with my first rig, had blown a tire on Interstate 40 and barely made it to the truck stop. I was fumbling with the jack, looking like a complete rookie, when Miguel walked up. "Need a hand, rookie?" He rolled up his sleeves before what was supposed to be a quick tire change turned into a 4-hour conversation that changed the course of my life. Miguel had been on the road for over 30 years, knew every back road and shortcut across the country, and had the kind of wisdom you can't get from a book. Miguel showed me how to properly change that tire, then bought me a cup of coffee and proceeded to drop knowledge bombs on everything, from the best routes to avoid way stations, to how to negotiate better rates with dispatchers. "This ain't just about driving, kid," he told me, tapping his temple. "It's up here. Gotta be smarter than the road." He became my unofficial mentor. We'd cross paths at truck stops whenever our routes lined up, and he introduced me to his network of trusted mechanics, dispatchers, and loading dock managers all across the country. The kind of connections that make the difference between barely scraping by and actually thriving in this business. Miguel was the one who encouraged me to save up and buy my own rig instead of staying with a company. Hands down, the best advice I ever took. 2 years ago, he had a heart attack while driving through Arizona. Managed to pull his rig over safely before collapsing. By some miracle, I was at the same rest area. I recognized his truck, found him, and got him to the hospital just in time. The doctors told me if I'd found him even 20 minutes later, he wouldn't have made it. After he recovered, Miguel decided it was time to retire. He sold me his routes and client list for a fraction of what they were worth, saying he'd rather pass them on to someone who cared than to some faceless corporation. That's how I went from a struggling driver to owning my own small but profitable operation. All because an old trucker took pity on a kid with a blown tire, and I just ran with it. I'd clench my teeth and nod when Dad would go on about how real success requires education. While he'd glare at me, I'd smile when relatives would ask what I was still doing for work, like truck driving was just some temporary gig I'd gotten stuck in. I kept telling myself they were family, and family sticks together, no matter what. Man, was I wrong. It all started when Courtney got engaged to this guy named Paul, a boring investment banker with the personality of a stapler. But he drove a Tesla and came from family money. My parents were practically planning a royal wedding over it. I first heard about Paul last Christmas. Courtney wouldn't stop going on about him, how his career was on track, how his family had a summer place in the Hamptons. I just nodded along. Paul was exactly what you'd expect. Tall, perfect teeth, hair that probably cost more to maintain than my truck payment. The kind of guy who brings up his prep school days like he was a POW. The first time I met him, he asked me what I did for a living. When I told him I was a truck driver, he actually said, "Oh, that's necessary, I suppose." Like I was a sewage worker or something. Then he went off on this condescending rant about how autonomous vehicles were going to make my job obsolete in 5 years. I just smiled and nodded, thinking about how this guy probably couldn't change a tire if his life depended on it. I was in the middle of a run in Nebraska when Courtney called to tell me about the engagement. The signal was spotty, but I could hear the excitement in her voice, and honestly, I was happy for her. We weren't exactly close, but she was still my sister. She mentioned that they were having a big engagement party at Mom and Dad's in 3 weeks. I checked my schedule, I'd have to shuffle some routes, maybe swap with another driver, but nothing impossible. Then she suggested I dress up for the event since Paul's family would be there. The way she said it made it clear that my usual flannel and jeans wouldn't cut it. The next day, I called Mom to confirm I'd be coming and to ask if they needed me to bring anything. Dad picked up instead. His voice always had this way of making me feel like I was 12 years old again, like I'd just broken something valuable. What happened next still makes my blood boil. Dad flat out told me it might be better if I skipped the party. When I asked why, he fed me some BS about Paul's family being well connected, how his father was on the board of 3 companies, and his mother came from old money. Apparently, my job wasn't something they could brag about, and I didn't fit in with that kind of crowd. From there, the conversation only went downhill. He actually suggested that if I insisted on coming, I should lie about my job, say I was in logistics management instead of telling the truth about driving trucks. Then, he had the audacity to tell me not to share any of my truck stop stories because no one wanted to hear them, as if my life experiences were something to be ashamed of. And then he said it. If you come and embarrass this family in front of Paul's parents, don't bother calling me your father anymore. I didn't even respond. I just hit end call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat like it was on fire. The highway stretched ahead of me, endless and empty, just like I felt inside. Diesel jumped up from his dog bed behind my seat and rested his head on my lap. He could sense my mood. Dogs always know. After that call, I pulled into the next rest stop and just sat there, the engine idling, trying to process what had just happened. My own father had basically told me I was too embarrassing to attend my sister's engagement party. Too embarrassing to even acknowledge what I actually did for a living. The rest stop was one of those places in the middle of nowhere. I sat on a bench, sharing beef jerky with Diesel, surrounded by other drivers eating sandwiches and smoking cigarettes. All of us avoiding going back to our cabs for just a little longer. That's when I ran into Sarah, a fellow driver I'd met at a few truck stops over the years. She mostly hauled electronics from the West Coast to the Midwest, and we'd occasionally share meals when our routes overlapped. Sarah was sharp, used to be a software engineer before she got tired of staring at screens and decided to see the country. She made more money driving trucks than coding, which always made me laugh. I must have looked like I'd been through the ringer because she sat down next to me without asking and handed me a coffee. "You look like someone ran over your dog," she said, using my last name the way truckers do. Diesel raised his head, and she scratched behind his ears. "No offense, buddy." I ended up telling her everything, about my family, the engagement party, my dad's ultimatum. She listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally and sipping her coffee. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, just watching the sunset. Then she turned to me and said, "You know what I learned in my previous life?" I raised an eyebrow. "Coding?" She shrugged. "If the system's broken, sometimes you gotta crash it and force a reboot." I stared at her, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" She took a sip of her coffee. "Just that maybe it's time your family learns what you're really worth to them. Sometimes people only appreciate what they had after it's gone." We ended up talking for another hour, mostly about roads, weather forecasts, and fuel prices, the usual trucker stuff. But her words stuck with me as I got back on the road that night. Maybe it was time for a system crash. That's when it hit me, just how much money I'd been sending them over the past 3 years. I'd been covering their property taxes, never missed a payment. Never said a word, just quietly transferred the cash every quarter because that's what family does, right? Family helps family, or so my dad always preached when he needed something from me. I grabbed my phone and opened my banking app. I started adding it up, scrolling through the transaction history, $350 every 3 months for 3 years, plus that $1,200 I dropped on the new water heater, and the $2,800 for the roof repair after that storm. Then there was Mom's dental work that insurance wouldn't cover, $1,700. It all added up to $13,500. $13,500. All of it coming out of my so-called, embarrassing, truck driver salary. And now I wasn't good enough to sit at the same table as my own family? Not even good enough to say what I actually did for a living? As I scrolled through all those transactions, I couldn't help but wonder, did Liam ever pitch in? Probably not. Too busy buying designer suits and leasing luxury cars to impress his lawyer buddies. I bet they didn't even ask him. And Courtney, she was always investing in her future, which apparently meant spending every dime on herself. My whole life, I'd been the family punching bag, the joke, the cautionary tale. They probably told their friends, make sure your kids go to college, or they'll end up like Jimmy. But I was also their wallet, their handyman, their emergency backup plan. Well, not anymore. I'm not usually the revenge type. I'm more of a live and let live guy. After all, I've seen too much on the road to get worked up over the small stuff. But something in me snapped that day at the rest stop, like a rubber band that had been stretched too far for too long. I opened my banking app again and went to the scheduled payment section. I found the one labeled Mom and Dad Property Tax that was set to go out next week, $3.50. I canceled it. Then I did something else. I remembered they'd been struggling with their mortgage too. They'd refinanced a couple of years back, and I recalled Mom mentioning how tight things got with Dad's pension coming in on the 3rd. The engagement party was scheduled for the 5th. I texted my buddy Eric, who works at the electric company. We go way back. I'd helped him move 3 times and never asked for anything in return. He was one of the few who never judged me for my job. I asked him when they typically shut off electricity for non-payment. He told me around the 5th or 6th if there had been warnings. Perfect timing for the next 2 weeks. I ignored all calls from my family. There weren't many, just one from Mom asking if I'd gotten the invitation, which I hadn't, and another from Courtney confirming I wasn't coming, which I didn't answer. Not a single call from my father. Not surprising. He probably thought he'd done me a favor by sparing me from an event where I would have been out of place. I kept driving my routes, hauling goods across the country. While this plan simmered in the back of my mind, there's a lot of time to think when you're driving for 10 hours straight with nothing but highway and radio for company. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed my pride for the sake of family peace. All the times I'd shown up to help them move furniture, fix plumbing, or jumpstart their cars, only to be treated like the family disappointment 5 minutes later. I'd done it so many times, quietly stepping into the role of the handyman when needed, but never acknowledged. Along the way, I called Miguel and told him what was going down. He listened quietly, then burst out laughing. "Mijo," he said, slipping into Spanish the way he did when he was really amused. "That's some cold-blooded shit. But you know what? Sometimes the family needs to learn the hard way." Then he got serious. "Just make sure this is what you really want. Revenge tastes sweet at first, but it can leave a bitter aftertaste." I thought about it for another 100 miles. Was this too far? Maybe. But so was telling your son he's too embarrassing to attend a family function. My buddy Marcus, who runs a small catering business, texted me about a week before the party. "Dude, just got hired for some fancy engagement party at your parents' place. Should I hook you up with some extra appetizers?" Marcus joked. I laughed out loud in my empty truck cab. Told him I wasn't invited because the family thought I was too embarrassing. He offered to spit in the food as a joke, but I just asked him to tell me how it goes. And the day before the engagement party, I checked my bank account. The property tax payment would have gone out today, but it didn't. For the first time in 3 years, my parents would miss a payment. If I knew my parents, they hadn't been keeping track of these payments themselves. They probably didn't even know they were due. Timing is everything. The day of Courtney's engagement party arrived. I was on a haul back from Chicago, deliberately taking my time. Around 5 p.m. exactly, when the party was supposed to start, according to the invitation I never received, my phone started blowing up. First text from Mom, "Jimmy. Something's wrong with the electricity. It's gone out and we have a house full of guests. Can you call the company?" Second text from Dad, "The electric company said we're behind on payments. This is ridiculous. Fix this now." Third text from Courtney, "OMG. Jimmy, please help. Class Paul's parents are here and we have no power. This is ruining everything. Do something." I didn't respond to any of them. Just kept driving. Radio turned up loud, singing along to some old country song. I was about 2 hours from home and had no plans to rush. Diesel was snoring in his bed, oblivious to the chaos unfolding in my family. Lucky dog. An hour later, Marcus sent me a photo that was absolutely priceless. A bunch of well-dressed people standing around in my parents' dark living room, lit only by the emergency lights and a few candles. Paul's parents looked super uncomfortable. His mom was clutching her pearls, literally wearing pearls, and his dad was checking his watch every 30 seconds. Courtney looked like she was about to cry, her makeup starting to run. Dad looked murderous, his face all red and blotchy the way it gets when he's really pissed. Mom was frantically lighting more candles, while the food was getting warm. Rich people were leaving, and Paul's dad had apparently asked if my parents often failed to pay their utilities. When Marcus mentioned to Paul's mom that he had catered an event for me last month, she seemed surprised I could afford catering. Marcus told her I owned my own transportation business, which was technically true. I do own my rig. "Dude," Marcus texted later, "she asked so many questions about you after that, like she couldn't believe the truck driver brother was doing better than the lawyer and tech girl. I may have embellished a bit and said you had a fleet. Hope that's cool," and I snorted at the thought of a fleet, me, Diesel, and 18 wheels, but I appreciated the backup. Another hour passed. My phone kept lighting up with increasingly desperate messages. "Liam, whatever you're doing, stop it. Mom, this isn't funny. Dad, Jimmy, you'll regret this. Mom again, please, sweetheart, if this is about what your father said, we can talk about it later. Just help us now. Courtney, I hate you. You've ruined the most important day of my life. Around 8 p.m., when I knew the party was thoroughly destroyed, I finally called my mother. I was parked at a truck stop by then, eating a sandwich and feeling strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes after you've finally stood up for yourself after a lifetime of taking crap. I told her about the property tax payments I'd been making for 3 years, about the water heater, the roof, the dental work. She had no idea. Dad had just told her it was taken care of, without ever mentioning that it was her embarrassing truck-driving son keeping a roof over their heads. When Dad got on the phone, he was furious. I pointed out the irony, how it felt to be humiliated in front of people whose opinion you care about. I told him this truck driver had been keeping their lights on, their house from being taken by the county, and asked how it felt to be the embarrassment tonight. He hung up. I finished my sandwich and got back on the road. For the first time in years, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The aftermath was nuclear. Paul broke off the engagement a week later. Apparently, his old money parents couldn't handle being associated with a family that couldn't even keep their electricity on during a formal party. I heard from Sarah a few days after the party fiasco. She'd been in Texas when it all went down, but news like that travels fast through our trucker grapevine. She must have heard about it in record time. She called, and I could hear the smile in her voice. How's the reboot going? Still loading, I replied, but at least the screen's not frozen anymore. She laughed. Sometimes a hard reset is the only way. Just don't forget to install some better programming this time around. It was good advice. I wasn't interested in destroying my family, just forcing them to see me clearly. For once. Courtney called me sobbing, blaming me for ruining her life. She left a voicemail that was mostly unintelligible, screeching, but I could make out phrases like selfish, jerk, and ruined everything between the sobs. I texted back, Dad's pride cost you your relationship. I just stopped cleaning up his messes. I felt bad for Courtney for about 5 minutes. Then I remembered how she'd never stood up for me, how she joined in on the jokes about my career, how she'd never once called me just to see how I was doing on the road. The sympathy faded pretty quickly after that. Liam surprisingly called me a few days later, not to yell, but to ask what the hell happened. We hadn't really talked much in years. He was always too busy with his important lawyer life. He was genuinely shocked to learn that I'd been paying their property taxes, the water heater, the roof, and Mom's dental work. They'd never told him things were that bad. I pointed out that, of course, they hadn't. He was the golden child, and they couldn't tarnish that image. When I asked how much he had contributed to keeping them afloat, he admitted he just sent gift cards for Christmas and birthdays, gift cards, while claiming he couldn't help more because of student loans. The same student loans that somehow didn't prevent him from buying a Land Cruiser or taking ski trips to Aspen every winter. I ignored all contact from my family after that, blocked their numbers, filtered their emails to trash. I needed space to think, to figure out what I wanted for the first time. I was driving routes without that nagging worry about whether my parents' bills were getting paid. It felt good, freeing. I thought a lot about what family means during those long drives, about obligation versus love, and about how sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who see you the least. I watched America roll by my windshield and wondered where I fit in all of it. Miguel checked in on me now and then. He didn't say I told you so about the bitter aftertaste of revenge, but I could tell he was worried. Family is complicated, he said during one call. Everyone's trying to live up to something. Their parents' expectations, their own dreams, society's definition of success. Sometimes we're so busy looking up at where we think we should be, he continued, we don't see who's holding the ladder. There was something about driving truck that gave you perspective. You see how temporary everything is, how fragile. You deliver goods to places hit by tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, and you see how quickly what people thought was permanent can be washed away. You drive through towns where the main industry shut down and everyone's just trying to survive. Makes family drama seem small in comparison. The calls and texts eventually stopped. I figured they'd written me off completely, and honestly, I was fine with that. I had friends who respected me, colleagues who valued my work ethic at truck stops and diners across the country. I had conversations with people who treated me like a human being, not a disappointment. Then, about 6 weeks after the engagement party disaster, my landlord Steve knocked on my door. I was home between hauls, enjoying some rare downtime with Diesel. There's a couple outside asking for you, he said. Older folks say they're your parents. I sighed. Thanks, Steve. I found them standing awkwardly by their old Buick in the parking lot. They looked smaller somehow. Mom had been crying, her eyes, puffy and red. Dad looked defeated. I'd never seen him like that before. His shoulders were slumped, the confident posture gone. He looked his age for the first time I could remember. "What are you doing here?" I asked, not inviting them up. It was a chilly day, and I didn't offer them my jacket or suggest we go inside. Diesel stood by my side, unusually quiet, studying these strangers who smelled like me. "We came to apologize," Mom said quietly. She tried to step toward me, but I didn't move. Dad wouldn't look me in the eye. "We made a mistake," Mom added. "Which one?" I asked, my voice flat. "Not appreciating that I've been keeping you afloat for years? Or telling me I'm too embarrassing to invite to family events?" Dad hesitated, glancing at Mom, then back at the ground. "Both," she whispered, tears welling up. "We had no idea how much you've been helping us," Mom continued. "Your father, he never told me." I looked at him. Of course he didn't. Would have ruined the narrative that I'm the family failure. Dad finally looked up. "I was wrong about everything." "Yeah, you were," I said, crossing my arms. It was strange seeing him like this. The man who had always seemed so strong, so sure of himself, now looking small and afraid. "We're in trouble, Jimmy," Mom said, her voice breaking. "Real trouble. The bank, they're threatening foreclosure. We're behind on the mortgage. Not my problem anymore." I started to turn away, but then Dad said it. "Please." I almost fell over at the sound of that word. Please. In 34 years, I'd never heard him say that to me. "We need help." I let them stew for a minute in the parking lot before I spoke again. "So let me get this straight. I'm good enough to bail you out, but not good enough to sit at your table." Dad didn't respond, and Mom only lowered her eyes. "Aren't," I continued, my voice bitter, "and Liam, what's he contributing to this family emergency?" Mom looked down, guilt tracing her features. "He says his money is all tied up in investments he can't liquidate right now." I laughed. Not a happy laugh. "Of course, the golden child can't be bothered. But the embarrassment with the truck, he's your last hope, right?" Dad nodded, reluctantly. "We don't have anywhere else to turn." He admitted it, he had to. That must have cost him, especially after years of pride. He was never one to admit weakness. I thought about all the times they'd made me feel small, all the dinner conversations where they praised my siblings and ignored me, the backhanded comments about my phase of truck driving that had lasted nearly a decade. The way they dismissed my stories about life on the road while hanging on every word of Liam's boring legal anecdotes. But I also remembered something my grandfather told me before he died, the only family member who ever respected my choices. He had been a factory worker his whole life. Being right doesn't always mean being happy, he had told me once, as we sat on his porch, the summer air thick with the smell of fresh-cut grass. My grandfather had never had the luxury of choices. His work had always been what it was, hard, practical, necessary. He didn't have time to question it. But he respected my decision to carve out my own path, even if it meant taking a road less traveled. Even if it didn't always seem glamorous or prestigious. And as I stood there, facing the people who had spent my life questioning my choices, I knew what I had to do. Never made much money, never had much education, but my grandfather was the wisest person I knew. He taught me how to fish, how to change oil, how to look someone in the eye when you shake their hand. Simple stuff that mattered more than any degree or job title. I thought about what Miguel said about holding the ladder, what Sarah said about installing better programming after the crash. Maybe this was the chance to redefine what family meant for all of us. "Here's the deal," I said, finally, cutting through the tension. "I'll help you. Not because you deserve it, but because I'm not like you. I don't abandon family. Even when they treat me like shit." Relief washed over their faces. Mom actually started crying again, but I kept going, my voice firm. "There are conditions." "Anything," Mom said quickly, wiping her eyes. "First, I'm not giving you money. I'm buying the house from you. You'll sign it over to me, and I'll cover the mortgage. You can live there until you die, but it's mine." They both looked stunned, but I pressed on. "Second, I get an apology. A real one, in writing. A copy to Liam and Courtney, laying out exactly how you've treated me and exactly how much I've helped you over the years." Mom looked like she was about to speak, but I raised my hand, stopping her. "Third, next family gathering, Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever, you tell everyone present exactly what happened. How the truck driver's son you were so embarrassed by was the one keeping a roof over your heads." "That's humiliating," Dad muttered, his face flushed with shame. "Welcome to my world," I shot back, unflinching. "Those are my terms. Take them or leave them." There was a long pause. The weight of it hung in the air, but I knew this was the only way for them to truly see me. Not just as the son they dismissed all these years, but as someone who'd always been there when they needed it, even if they never acknowledged it. Mom wiped her face, and Dad stood there, silent, like he was considering the full scope of what I was asking. The fight for respect was never going to be easy, but this was a step toward making sure they understood. Maybe it wouldn't fix everything. Maybe we would never be a perfect family. But it would be something real. Something I could live with. Mom's face twisted as she absorbed the weight of my words. Dad just stood there, silent, looking small, like the air had been sucked out of him. But I wasn't finished. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about respect. About showing them, finally, what I'd been trying to say all these years without ever being heard. Third, I continued, my voice steady, next family gathering, Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever, you tell everyone present exactly what happened. How the truck driver's son you were so embarrassed by was the one keeping a roof over your heads. Dad opened his mouth like he was about to protest, but I cut him off. That's humiliating, he muttered, his voice low and thick with shame. Welcome to my world, I shot back, not backing down. You don't get to decide what's humiliating for me anymore. Those are my terms. Take them or leave them. There was a long pause, the silence so heavy I could practically hear the weight of their thoughts, the weight of their pride crumbling. For the first time in years, I could see them for who they really were, fallible, broken, and human. Mom wiped her face with the back of her hand, sniffling as she looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something like regret in her eyes. But it wasn't just the sadness of being caught. It was something deeper. Maybe she realized how much I'd done for them, how much I'd silently supported them, always from the background, never acknowledged. Dad, still silent, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes flicking to the ground before meeting mine. It was like he was trying to reconcile the man I'd become with the boy he used to belittle. I wasn't the screw-up anymore. I wasn't the embarrassment. All right, Dad said finally, his voice quiet, strained. We'll do it. We'll do all of it. Mom nodded, her face crumpling as she stepped forward, extending her arms, but I didn't move to embrace her. Not yet. Thank you, she whispered. We were wrong. I didn't say anything at first. Part of me wanted to say something sharp, something cutting, but instead, I just stood there. The weight of the moment settled in, and I realized this wasn't about forgiveness, it was about understanding. Understanding that family isn't perfect, but it's still family. Just remember, I said, turning to walk back toward my apartment, Diesel trotting ahead, this doesn't fix everything. It doesn't mean everything's okay. But it's a start. And maybe that's all I need. They didn't follow me inside. They stood there, watching me, and as I closed the door behind me, I felt the smallest glimmer of something shift. Not between us, not yet, but inside of me. A weight had shifted off my shoulders. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had control over what happened next. He looked around, his eyes taking in the old furniture, the familiar creaks in the floorboards, and the half-finished projects that had been left behind when I moved out. It was strange seeing him in this space, almost like seeing an old mentor visiting a classroom he'd once taught in, except now I was the teacher. You've done good here, Jimmy, Miguel said, his voice low but approving. You've taken control of your life, and you've turned it around. This house, your business, it's all yours now. I nodded, feeling a sense of pride I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. A sense of power that had always been denied to me by the very people I'd spent my life trying to gain approval from. It's funny, I said, gesturing around at the walls that used to feel like a prison. I spent so much time trying to prove myself to them. And now, I own it all. The house. The business. My life. Miguel chuckled softly. Sometimes, the only way to get people to see you clearly is to show them you don't need their approval anymore. You've done that. He paused, turning to face me. But don't forget, Jimmy. You're not just building a future for yourself. You're also building a legacy. Something that can stand on its own. The idea settled in my mind like a seed. Legacy. It was something I'd never considered before. I'd always been so focused on surviving, on keeping things afloat, that I hadn't stopped to think about what kind of future I was leaving behind. But now, with everything in my hands, maybe I could build something that would outlast me. Sarah checked in a few times after the dust had settled with my family. She'd always been a bit of a sounding board, someone to bounce ideas off of. And as I sat in the house that had shaped so much of who I was, I couldn't help but wonder what she'd think about this new chapter. You still feel like the truck driver? She asked me one night, her voice warm over the phone. I looked around my living room, at the paintings I'd picked out, the simple but sturdy furniture, and the shelves filled with books and tools I'd collected. The smell of Diesel's fur lingered in the air. I smiled a little. No, I said, settling back into the couch. I don't think I ever will again. And in that moment, I realized that the most important thing I'd learned over the past few months wasn't about winning against my family or proving them wrong. It was about finding peace with who I was, where I was, and what I'd done. Maybe I hadn't followed the traditional path to success. Maybe I'd never been the golden child. But I was exactly where I needed to be. This house, this life, it was mine. It always had been. Good bones, he said, tapping a wall like you. When he met my parents, they were awkward, but polite. Dad tried to make small talk about the trucking industry, asking Miguel questions. He'd never bothered to ask me. Your son, Miguel told them while pointing at me, is one of the best drivers I know. Saved my life once, got more sense and skill than half the fancy degree holders I've met. The look on my dad's face was worth every penny I'd spent on that house. Liam finally pulled his head out of his ass and apologized too, said he never realized how bad things had gotten, even offered to help with the mortgage, but I told him it was handled. Sarah was right. The system reboot seemed to be working. Courtney's still barely speaking to me, but she'll come around when she realizes Paul was a douche. Anyway, for all his family money, he sure was quick to bail when things got tough. Not exactly the kind of guy you want by your side during life storms. I'm the best part. Dad actually asked me about my job last week, like genuinely asked. Wanted to know about routes and schedules and what it's like living on the road. Small victories, I guess. So that's my story. Read it, was I too harsh maybe? But after a lifetime of being the family disappointment, there's something deeply satisfying about being the family savior instead. Life's weird, and then you buy your parents' house.